Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bob Burnham. I'm Dean of the College of Education, and I welcome you here this afternoon on behalf of the faculty of the College of Education. This is the 1981 Boyd H. Boda Memorial Lecture. I am both pleased and apologetic about the turnaway crowd, and we do have a commitment from WOSU who is videotaping this entire presentation, that they will broadcast it at the first possible opportunity. So tell your friends and colleagues that they will be able to view the proceedings just as soon as WOSU can get airtime. I would like to commend Professor Phil Smith, who is chair of the Boda Lecture Committee, and the members of the committee, Pat Schmidt, John Toffel, and Howard Noel, who organized today's lecture. Further, I would like to thank Professor Paul Isaac of the Department of Psychology and Dean Lapidus of the Graduate School for their support of this lecture. Although it's rather crowded in the aisles and the rest, well, let me just say that Professor Skinner has graciously agreed to answer questions, that is, written questions from the floor following his lecture. At that time, ushers will bring to the podium any questions you would care to ask, and it'll give you an opportunity to have a dialogue. My main role here today is to give you the background on the Boda Lecture program. In addition to those written comments that you have in today's program, I would like to add that Boyd Boda was one of the giants of educational thought in the first half of the century. He was a contemporary of John Dewey, William Kilpatrick, and William James. A number of his students became distinguished philosophers of education in their own right. Let me quote briefly from a eulogy written by Frederick C. Neff, one of Boda's students. Professor Neff said, "To Boda, education embodied a gospel to live by. Combining the gentle humor of a Will Rogers with the wisdom of a Socrates, he taught classes in the philosophy of education as a series of hairbreadth escapes." Neff continues, "He came not as an emissary of compromise and appeasement, but with fire and sword, and we soon learned both to be wary of and delight in the barbed wit that flowed through his lectures." In Neff's view, Boda had been first of all a philosopher and was a past master of the subtleties of logic. Horse sense made asinine is what Boda once called logic. The gospel that Boda lived by was democracy, and when he spoke of the democratic ideal, he spoke softly, almost reverently, for here was the heart of his religion. Based on my reading of various bibliographic materials of Boda, I gathered that he was universally critical, not indiscriminately, but universally. He lashed out at the scientific movement, at behaviorism, at the classical point of view, at the weakening of democratic outlook, and at the whole tradition of Platonic philosophizing. I would like to quote a brief part of what Professor Boda said in 1949, 4 years prior to his death, at the opening of the fourth Boda Memorial, at that point, at the fourth Boda Conference. He said, "The basic task of education is to provide a scheme for living. If we place the need for moral insight into the center of the picture, all our educational problems will fall into proper perspective, and education becomes the grandest profession in all the world." He went on to say, "As a final word, let me add the hope that the Ohio State University will become an outstanding center for the development of a democratic philosophy of life and of education. It has the people." Boda concluded, "The College of Education works with an enlightened school system and an enlightened public. It has material resources, and it has the living heritage of our American tradition of democracy. It is home for me. It is where my friends are. It is where we speak a common language. I have been away more than I expected, but I insist that I belong and that I am entitled to a share in your interests and your affections." End of quote. The essence of Boyd Boda's critical scholarship and ideals are part of the tradition of this great university, and they are with us today as we open our minds to the Boyd Henry Boda Memorial Lecture for 1981. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Des Cook, a representative of the Faculty of Educational Foundations and Research, the faculty group which Boyd Boda called home. Professor Cook is one of our distinguished faculty members, who, by the way, holds a joint appointment both in the Department of Psychology and in Educational Foundations. Professor Cook will introduce our distinguished guest speaker.
Thank you, Dean Burnham. For each of us, life is a kaleidoscope of events whose impact is not clearly foreseen. In my own case, there were two past events that have a relationship to the event of this afternoon. First, as an undergraduate student in education at Ohio University, I was introduced to the thinking and writings of Boyd Boda on the philosophy of education. Second, as a graduate student in educational psychology at the University of Iowa, I was heavily exposed to the ideas and research contributions of B.F. Skinner on the conditions of learning. Little did I realize at the time that these two events would merge together at this time and at this place in the form of being invited to introduce Dr. Skinner as the presenter of the 1981 Boyd Boda Memorial Lecture. I accepted this task with a great deal of professional and personal humility. Your program contains some background notes about our speaker's interests and contributions. Let me add a few more that might be of interest, particularly to those in the audience less acquainted with the man and his works. Dr. Skinner is a native of Pennsylvania and completed his undergraduate degree at Hamilton College in 1926. He received a PhD in psychology from Harvard University in 1931. In 1936, he joined the faculty of the University of Minnesota, and from 1945 to 1948, he served as chairman of the psychology department at Indiana University. In 1948, he returned to his alma mater, Harvard, where he is now Emeritus Edgar Price Professor of Psychology. Dr. Skinner's research and ideas have been published widely over the years. He has authored 8 books, 2 of which, Walden II and Beyond Freedom and Dignity, are very well known. Perhaps less familiar to many, but just as influential, are such publications as The Technology of Teaching, Science and Human Behavior, and Schedules of Reinforcement. In addition to being an author, Dr. Skinner has been the inventor of apparatus to do research. Among the more publicized devices are the air crib, or the baby box, as it's commonly called, to study infant behavior, the renowned Skinner box used to study animal behavior, and the teaching machine to implement his ideas about human learning. Recognition of his many contributions to both theory and practice in psychology and education have come from a variety of sources. I should like to highlight only 2. In 1971, he received the gold medal of the American Psychological Association. In 1978, he was the recipient of the Distinguished Contributions to Research and Education Award from the American Educational Research Association. But you are gathered here this afternoon not to hear about Dr. Skinner, but to hear from him. So let us proceed. Before turning the podium over to our speaker, let me reiterate the point that upon completion of the presentation, Dr. Skinner will entertain questions for a brief period. It now gives me an immense honor to present to you Dr. B.F. Skinner, who will address you on the theme, Why We Are Not Doing More to Improve Education. Dr. Skinner.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Cook. Ladies and gentlemen, although Professor Boda's career and mine overlapped by a few years. I never had the pleasure of knowing him, but from what I've read about him and by him, it seems to be a rather similar pattern. And I emphasize that I didn't know him, lest you think that I patterned my life on his. He grew up in a rather strict Calvinistic religious background. My own family belonged to a gentler sect, the Presbyterians, but I had my time of being afraid of the devil, and it was as recent as 1972 that I began a lecture, which I gave at the time, in the following way. A critic contends that my book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, does not contain anything new, that much the same was said more than 4 centuries ago in theological terms by John Calvin. You will not be surprised then to find me commending to you the steep and thorny way to that heaven promised by a science of behavior. But I am not one of those ungracious pastors of whom Ophelia complains, who, recking not their own reed, themselves tread the primrose path of dalliance. No, I shall rail at dalliance, and in a manner worthy, I hope, of my distinguished predecessor. If I do not thunder or fulminate, it is only because we moderns can more easily portray a truly frightening hell. I shall merely allude to the carcinogenic fallout of a nuclear holocaust. Early in our careers, we both were very much concerned with the problem of consciousness and whether a behavioristic interpretation of consciousness was possible. We were both interested in theories of knowledge and the possibility of psychology as a science of behavior. Names occur in our careers together. Boda wrote a paper about Ernst Mach, and Mach is the first name that appears in my thesis. He mentions Bertrand Russell, and it was Bertrand Russell's review of a book by Ogden and Richards which directed my attention to John B. Watson, and hence eventually to behaviorism. Later, we became interested in the social implications of all this, and one of his titles, Personal Freedom, Democracy, and Social Control, could have been the title of several of my papers. I don't know whether Professor Boda would like what I'm going to say today, but if he doesn't, I will have established my independence, and if he does not, I can't complain. In a recent issue of Science, the magazine of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Frederick Mosteller gave his presidential address called Innovation and Fulfillment. He dealt with the great lag between discovery and the use of discovery. He began with the curious case of vitamin C. In the beginning of the 17th century, when long sea voyages became possible with the compass and the invention of good chronometers, it was the case in general that about half the crew died before the voyage was completed. Half the crew. They died of scurvy. But in 1601, it was shown that 3 teaspoons full of lemon juice every day would prevent scurvy. Few got ill. In 1747, it was shown that citrus fruit would cure scurvy. In 1795, the British Navy began using citrus fruit on a regular basis, and in 1865, the British Board of Trade made it a rule that the mercantile marine should have citrus fruit. There was a lag of 264 years. Mosteller was apparently not aware of the fact that he ends his address with another good example of a lag in discovery. He notes the erosion of education in science and mathematics. He proposes that the AAAS strengthen its efforts in education. It should mount a program on science and engineering in education, and that the theme for 1982 should be toward a national commitment to educational excellence in science and engineering education. Now, in 1960, in a school in Roanoke, Virginia, an 8th grade class covered all of 9th grade algebra in one term. They used simple teaching machines and a program which was being written by a high school instructor in algebra, barely keeping ahead of the class. At the end of that one term, their grades they met the norms of a 9th grade class for a full year's work, and when they were tested a year later, their retention scores were far better than normal. Now, there is a lag of 20 years, but if you appreciate the acceleration in history, it comes to about the same as 200 years, 2 or 3 centuries ago. I could give you many other examples in which extraordinarily effective teaching with various devices and programs was achieved. But did the educational establishment simply say, that is the way to teach algebra? Why should we look any further for good high school instruction? If we want everyone to know algebra, this is the way to teach. Not at all. A few months ago, the National Science Foundation sponsored a 200-page book called What Are the Needs of Pre-College Education in Science and Mathematics? There was no mention of programmed instruction, teaching machines, and only one page devoted to how teachers teach. And that was spent mostly on whether they used recitation or papers or demonstrations or laboratory and so on. The achievement, which had been perfectly clear, was completely ignored. It's a lag comparable to that in the use of knowledge of what turned out to be, of course, vitamin C. Now, why do we not take advantage of discoveries to improve education? I think the reason was stated 400 years ago by a Czech educator, Comenius, who said, the more the teacher teaches, the less the student learns. Now, he didn't mean that literally. If that were the case, we'd have to get rid of all teachers immediately. What he meant was, the more the teacher seems to be doing the teaching, the less the student can get credit for learning. And that is really my theme today. We are afraid to teach effectively because it seems to rob the student of credit for learning. It's a general principle in education. Teach in such a way that teaching is inconspicuous and the student's change very conspicuous. Maximize the student's contribution in the educational process. We talk of independent study. Independent means independent of a teacher or even of a textbook. We talk of deschooling society, putting the students on their own in a learning environment. We like best students who learn for no good reason at all. We marvel at them and call it admirable in the sense of something we admire because we do not understand. It leaves too little for the student to do to teach really effectively. I discuss this issue in my book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, with respect to matters in general. Dignity or worth, in the sense of a sense of achievement, seems to be destroyed when reasons why we behave are revealed. Thus, if you are writing and you copy someone else's writing, that's plagiarism and you get no credit for it. If what you write is very much like what someone else wrote, it will be questioned. Have you been influenced by this person? A small amount of influence is accepted because it seems to be inevitable, but best of all would be the completely original, creative writing, which has no connection whatsoever with anything the writer could possibly have read. Now, unfortunately, science reveals the reasons why people behave as they do. And when those reasons become visible, the behavior seems to be taken away from the behaving individual. Now, I don't think anyone has said, I'm not going to teach well because I want my students to get credit when they learn. It isn't as obvious as that. But I want to go over today some of the symptoms of a very comparable attitude in which we, as teachers, tend to adopt those methods which give the student the greatest credit for working. One example of that is one example of the aggrandizement of the student is a tendency for educators to concentrate on the good student. You select. As a matter of fact, I believe there is in process here today some activity in selecting the best students from a selection and giving them special advantages or special support. The National Science Foundation Talent Search is that kind of thing. You like good students, and not only because you don't need to teach them very much, but because they get credit for what they're doing, you are not infringing upon their sense of dignity or worth. And there is an example of this, which brings me to the one person from Ohio State whom I knew best, was Sidney Pressey. In 1954, I gave a paper at the University of Pittsburgh called The Science of Learning and the Art of Teaching. In it, I pointed to a very flourishing study of the learning process. We had discovered how to shape behavior, how to take an individual organism and get it to do almost anything we wanted it to do. We had discovered how to arrange scheduled reinforcements so that the behavior continued to be emitted for as long as we liked. A great deal of control had been achieved in bringing about the changes called learning and achieving that state called motivation. I then turned to teaching and current education and compared the two. The lack of genuine control of the student, the lack of any great achievement in bringing about those changes which are called learning. Now, shortly after word of my talk got around, Professor Pressey wrote to me, and he sent me 3 reprints. In my talk, I had pointed to the fact that we had done these things with organisms in the laboratory because we could mechanize. When I first began my life as an animal psychologist, animal behaviorist, the researcher watched a single animal moving through an apparatus and made a record. But by the time I was giving this talk, we had advanced to a highly mechanized, instrumented state of the laboratory, saving our time and arranging conditions that could not be arranged by a person at first hand. And I had with me at the time a first teaching machine. It was on the stage, and I demonstrated it. You presented problems in arithmetic, and there were little holes in the tape, and by moving sliders, the student could cause figures to appear, and then by turning a knob, he would test whether that was the correct answer and move on to the next frame. So I said that what was needed in education were teaching machines. A young student in the audience at the time, sitting behind two professors of education, heard one say to the other, "He's kidding." But I wasn't, and I really believed that what Professor Pressey called the Industrial Revolution in education was coming. But Pressey sent me papers which revealed to me for the first time that he had been talking about teaching machines back in the 20s, before I ever became a psychologist, and wrote me a very charming letter. I replied, and that fall, at a meeting of the American Psychological Association, Professor Pressey and his wife and I had a delightful breakfast. In the third of his papers, he had expressed his discouragement and had said that he was abandoning the field. He was giving up, leaving it to others. But that morning at breakfast, we were both excited. It looked indeed as if the Industrial Revolution in education was coming. Then the teaching machine movement got underway, and very good things were done with fascinating results. A lot of junk was marketed as teaching machines. Programs were written by people who didn't understand what programming was all about. And Professor Pressey became discouraged again. And he wrote an article more or less implying that it was the kind of programmed instruction that I had been promoting which was causing the trouble, that not enough attention was paid to the type of teaching machine which he had designed. He sent me a copy and said, I want you to know I just felt I had to say this. Both all very friendly. Actually, there was a real difference between our positions, and it bears on my subject today. In the Pressey machine, the student has already studied material, and then he takes a multiple, he or she, and forgive me, I will use the word he to cover both sexes. He takes a multiple choice test. He chooses one or 4 or 5 answers, and if that is right, he moves on. If it is not, he must choose another, and so on. And the machine totals mistakes and successes, and an early machine actually paid off with a bit of candy, I believe, a bit of reinforcement. Anyway, the whole notion was that the student had really learned the material before coming to the machine. He had done his studying. But the machine had the advantage of confirming, adding a little bit extra. But in a program, the program is studying. Going through the program replaces studying. So that with the Pressey machine, the student could still get credit for having studied the book, having learned what was in it, and then simply testing himself. Whereas in a program, it's the program that gets the credit. You can't help learning with a program of instruction, but that is because you are not doing much yourself, but are profiting from the person who composed the program. That explains, I think, Pressey's great interest in the bright student, the bright youngster, as he called them. And shortly after this little disagreement, he wrote to me, and he said he noted that a 12-year-old had just registered at Harvard as a freshman, and he hoped that I would keep an eye on him. Well, I didn't, but my daughters did. My older daughter was then at Radcliffe, and she had a boyfriend who was a freshman also, and was actually rooming with this 12-year-old prodigy. And they were going to go to a football game, and the prodigy was going to go along, and they were looking for a companion. And my younger daughter was the same age. She was 12 at the time, so she went. She was in the 6th grade. Anyway, the emphasis on the good student it's a tempting kind of mistake to make. Obviously, you can go so far as to argue that the students who are worth teaching don't need to be taught at all. That lets you off the hook, and it gives maximal credit to the student. The other kind of emphasis upon giving credit to the student, not allowing effective teaching to deprive the student of credit, is a concern for techniques which deal with what is called now cognitive science. As you will see in a moment, very much regret the current absorption in cognitive science on the part of educators and educational philosophers. The reason that one turns to cognitive science is, again, I think, the effort to preserve the role of the student. A pamphlet issued by NIE, National Institute of Education, called Science and Technology and Education, contains the following introduction by Robert Glaser at Pittsburgh. At the present time, modern cognitive psychology is the dominant theoretical force in psychological science, as opposed to the first half of this century, when behavioristic, anti-mentalistic, stimulus-response theories of learning were in the ascendance. I think he means ascendant. Now, cognitive science, as applied to education, has certain clear disadvantages. For one thing, they never get behaviorism right. In Glaser's quote, for example, behaviorism is identified with stimulus and response. I was a stimulus response psychologist for 2 years, 1928 to 1930. Then my research made it quite clear to me that that wasn't the right formula. I changed, and for the succeeding 51 years, I have been saying I am not a stimulus response psychologist. And yet you will find articles about my work which say this is stimulus response psychologist. That is the kind of type of mistake that is made, and which leads to a great deal of trouble. The second reason why I think cognitive psychology is going to cause trouble is that they never very clearly define their terms. Things going on in the mind are not easy to point to. And as a result, cognitive psychologists pile up vague references, as if many words would somehow or other give them the security and the significance which they lack when they use the terms which are most frequently theirs. This NIE booklet tells us at one point that cognitive science is the study of learning, comprehending, problem-solving, and creation of new ideas. All very simple, straightforward. But no cognitive psychologist ever says it like that. Instead, we are told that cognitive science is characterized by a concern with learning, comprehending, problem-solving, and the creation of new ideas. But even that's too direct. And here is how the text actually reads. Cognitive science is characterized by a concern with understanding the mechanisms by which human beings carry out complex intellectual activities called comprehending, learning, problem solving, and the creation of new ideas. You can't say it in simple terms. Simplification is the mistake of behaviorism. So instead of saying a very simple thing, we're going to study learning, problem solving, we have to study, we are interested in a concern with understanding the mechanisms by which and so on. I can't resist giving you another example. In that same pamphlet, the statement is made essentially like, this point is what is actually made. What we are going to do is develop tests that will help us find better ways of teaching. Now that is simple, straightforward. But this is the way it is put. Attention will be placed on two specific topics: application of cognitive models of the knowledge structure of various subject matters, and of learning and problem solving to construction of tests that identify processes underlying test answers, analyze errors, and provide information about what students know and don't know, and strategies for integrating testing information with instructional decisions. Now, all that that says is we propose to study, test, and see whether they will help us find better ways of teaching. Strategies for integrating testing information with instructional decisions. How do you use the results of tests to teach better? Well, that is a kind of error, difficulty that cognitive science gets you into. You have to bolster it by mere verbiage. Thirdly, cognitive science is very strong on promise. We are told that it was a theoretical force. Yes, indeed. But it isn't a practical force. It isn't a sensible force. It doesn't do anything. The report quotes two short paragraphs from George Miller, and I've selected from those two paragraphs the following phrases which make it perfectly clear that he's talking not about anything cognitive science has done, but what he hopes it will do. He says there's no intrinsic difficulty in one case. However, there may be many practical and technical problems. Yes, indeed. It is a long leap from measuring comprehension to discovering thought processes. It is indeed, and the thought processes haven't been discovered by measuring comprehension. Such analysis still remains largely to be carried out. Right. With a better theoretical grasp, we could devise, but in spite of our great theoretical grasp, we have not. With better diagnosis, our deeper understanding can lead us to more effective teaching and learning techniques. Well, let us hope it does, but it hasn't done it, and I think there are reasons why it ever will. Because there are much more serious objections. I've been giving you superfluous reasons why I don't like cognitive psychology. I really don't like it because what it does is this. It studies human behavior, nothing else to be studied. This is what goes on in the laboratory of the cognitive psychologist. And it relates that behavior to some conditions, usually relations to stimulus conditions, getting a person to spot a concept in an array of stimuli or something of that kind. Then it makes the mistake of moving the stimulus conditions into the individual, as if the person had absorbed what is going on in the outside world. I'll give you a simple, I mentioned many of these examples in a paper called Why I Am Not a Cognitive Psychologist. I've chosen just one to give you here. You all know the Pavlovian situation. You ring a bell, give a hungry dog food. Then you ring the bell again, give the hungry dog food, and after half a dozen or a dozen times, you begin to notice that the dog is salivating just to the bell. And if you ask most anyone why, and particularly if you ask a cognitive psychologist, you'll be told it is because the dog associates the bell with food. Now, associate means to put together, side by side, to make a small society of. But it was not the dog that associated the bell And the food, it was Pavlov. It was Pavlov who rang the... But it's assumed that somehow or other the dog does it also inside. Now, the only evidence you have is that the dog starts to secrete saliva. And that is all that seems to be going on. However, when you take the external conditions under which animals and people learn and put them inside, then you get what the cognitive psychologist talks about as subjective behaviorism. Piaget used that expression. So did Miller, Galanter, and Pribram in their book, Plans and the Structure of Behavior. They are conjuring up a world, an inner world, in which all sorts of things go on, which are nothing more than the things that go on outside, and the range provide the conditions under which people actually learn. Now, the word cognition comes from the Latin cognoscere, and that word simply means to become acquainted with, be in contact with. We use, well, you know, there's a song from The King and I, Getting to Know You. Just getting to know in the sense of meeting up with you. We use the word familiar. Are familiar with people, and are you familiar with molecular biology? Being close to, being intimate with. And that can go pretty far, because in the Bible, to know a woman means to have intercourse with her. As a matter of fact, coition is etymologically related to cognition. We go even farther than that, because according to cognitive psychologists, having been so closely in touch with the world, you actually take it in. You go on a journey and you send a postcard back. Here we are taking in Paris. Wish you were here. We're taking in Paris. We're in contact with Paris, and it is being stored in our memories. And we are now in possession of various facts about Paris. This is a very important point for education, because after all, knowing is said to be the result of learning, and learning is the result of teaching. So when you teach, you want people to know. And that can go more than simply taking in the world in the sense in which Plato thought that you perceive things. You can deal with the same thing in terms of other complex contingencies of reinforcement. Plato couldn't understand how you would know something on the other side of the room, because you couldn't be intimate with it at that distance. So he assumed you had a copy in the back of your head. And the cave with the shadows was the metaphor there. We know now how an object on the other side of the room can affect an organism. We don't need to have a copy, and good modern behavior theory assumes that there is no copy of the world inside the head at any time, either when you are seeing the world or when you're recalling it later. But take an example in which something much more complex is said to be put inside. Some of you will know a simple experiment in which a hungry rat presses a lever, and that delivers a bit of food which the rat eats. Now, there is a simple result. The rat will press the lever again when hungry, and at possibly quite a high rate. But the cognitive psychologist will want to tell you that what the rat learns is that pressing the lever produces food. Now, pressing the lever produces food is a description of the apparatus. But just as Pavlov's dog was supposed to put what Pavlov did in his head, so the rat is supposed to put what I did, and we're wiring the circuit so that pressing the lever operated the food dispenser. The rat then has inside knowledge of the apparatus. This description of the apparatus is what is said to be acquired and possessed and taken in by the organism. Now, you may argue that, well, a human subject, nevertheless, will take something in of that kind of thing. If you gave a child a plunger to pull and get a bit of candy, the child not only would pull the plunger, but would know that pulling the plunger brings candy, be able to talk about it. And that is true, because with the discovery of verbal behavior, the possibility of elaborating a verbal repertoire, a language, the human species was able to save a great deal of time and trouble by telling people what to do rather than letting them learn by direct experience. And of course, we all learn most of what we know by having people tell us what will happen when we behave rather than behaving that way. If you want to teach someone to drive a car, you don't put him in a car out on the road somewhere and let him turn this button, this switch, and press that lever and turn that wheel and so on. You wouldn't get very far. You sit beside him out in the parking lot in the front of a supermarket on a Sunday morning with no cars around, and you say, now turn that switch and the car will start, and push the accelerator and it'll run more rapidly. Now let the brake off, and now let the clutch in, and so on and so on. And eventually, merely by following verbal instructions, that person will drive the car. But eventually, on the highway, that behavior is shaped by its consequences. And you don't continue to drive by following instructions. You drive because of what happens when you turn the wheel, when you put on the brake, when you step on the accelerator, and so on. So there are two ways of driving a car, one by following rules, and one by experiencing the consequences when you behave in a given way. I have a personal example of that difference. One of my daughters, I exploit my children. This is Deborah, the one that was raised in the box, the one who killed herself and became psychotic, and who is now suing me. That's the latest. That's the latest. He's actually a very successful artist, married, living in London, a very charming person. But when she was about 9 months old, I was holding her on my lap. We took her out of the box once in a while. And the room started to get dark, and I reached a table lamp beside me, and I turned it on, and she smiled. And I thought, a reinforcer. What can I do with it? So I waited until she lifted her left hand a little bit, and I turned the light on and off. And almost immediately, she was quite intelligent, almost immediately it came up again. I turned it on and off. Just very soon she was doing this to make the light come on. Now, several years later, after she'd come out of the box and was sleeping in a bed, I was talking to her after she'd gone to bed, and she was lying face down, and I was rubbing her back. I always like to build a good Oedipus complex in my daughters. And I thought that just for the fun of it, I would see whether I could use this as a reinforcer. So I waited until her leg came up a little bit, and I would rub, and I would stop, and the leg came up, and I rubbed. Then it was a great kick, and she started to laugh. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" She said, "When I lift my foot, you rub my back." Now, the only difference in the two cases is that she had learned to talk and could describe what is going on in the world around. And once you can do that, then you can actually state a rule which governs the contingencies of reinforcement. So there are two kinds of things we know. We know the things we learn because of the consequences when we do them, and we learn what people say about them. And in that sense, we can possess knowledge in the sense that we can state the rule, as we possess a poem in the sense that we can recite it. But we don't possess the knowledge of the apparatus or the situation in any other form. The cognitive psychologists use the computer as an example of human thinking, but computers only follow rules. They do not represent the kind of change that goes on in a person when you come into contact with contingencies of reinforcement. You could presumably construct a computer that would try something and learn from experience, but the computers which are offered as artificial intelligence or which play chess and so on are simply following rules. There are two ways you can learn to play chess. Capablanca, a very great chess player, was an intuitive player. He watched his uncle and father playing and apparently just acquired an enormous sense of strong positions and could play simply by improving the strength of positions. Very different from thinking moves through and seeing what's going to happen by following the rules. But ordinarily, people who play chess do what computers do. Look ahead, see what's going to happen, and then make a choice. The cognitive psychologists try to bring these two things together by saying that when you learn, you discover rules. As if at 9 months old, Deborah discovered the rule that lifting the arm turns the light on. There's no evidence for that at all, and putting the rules inside when they had never been formulated by anyone simply doesn't work. Chomsky attacked my book, Rebel Behavior, and argues that when children learn to speak grammatically, they discover the rules of grammar. But until the time of the Greeks, no one knew there were rules of grammar, yet people spoke grammatically. And it's clear enough that it is not the discovery of the rule, but simply the response to the reinforcements which shape behavior and maintain it. There's another movement, another theme in modern education, which again seems to justify itself by leaving a great deal to the individual. And that is the current rage for developmental psychology. As if somehow or other, in the Piagetian sense, the child simply continues to mature, develops new ways of thinking as he grows older. That is a horticultural metaphor. And the word training, we use training, people are training for a race, training for a boxing match and things sort of thing. The word training comes originally from directing the branches of a tree or something and training a plant. If you want to get an espalier tree, you plant a tree right beside a wall and cut off that branch and twist that branch this way, and before long you'll have a tree which is beautiful, looks like a candelabra. It's an espalier tree against the wall. It has fruit, very conveniently placed for picking. No matter how much you train, the tree that is there is still a pear tree or an apple tree or something like that. You have guided, but you haven't actually produced the final result. And that offers a kind of safety for people who don't want to meddle too much in others by teaching them. And the whole formula that you cannot teach but only help the student learn follows that theme. You guide, you train, you cultivate, and it leaves the achievement to the individual. He or she has matured, has reached a level of knowledge or skill, and that is that. Now, actually, if you will examine any of these examples closely, you find that what is developing are the contingencies of reinforcement, the various Erik Erikson stages of personality. Those simply describe ways in which people treat other people well or badly, as the case may be. That would be true of Kohlberg's development. I just don't believe that the moral sense grows. I think that as children get older, there are different standards imposed, different sanctions imposed, and that it is the development of the society which leads to the change in moral behavior. And I think what I gathered from talking with some of you yesterday is being done here would be making clear that these environmental events do indeed occur, so that what Kohlberg seems to feel is a natural growth inside will indeed be carried on. And that brings me at last to creativity as the great example of something which must be the achievement of the individual. It's been offered as disproof of any kind of behavioristic challenge. And of course, a stimulus response psychology wouldn't handle creativity, because if everything's just a response to a stimulus, then the stimulus actually causes it. But the other explanations of creativity are not very satisfactory either. There's a famous passage in one of Moliere's plays in which a man who was a candidate for a doctor's degree, a physician's degree, says, "I am asked by the learned doctors for the cause and reason why opium puts one to sleep, to which I reply that there is in it a soporific virtue, the nature of which is to lull the senses." That is the kind of double talk which goes on all the time. You explain creative behavior by attributing creativity to a person. And if you don't think people do that, I can cite an article in that same magazine, Science, about a year ago. The article pointed out that 90% of scientific innovation is accomplished by fewer than 10% of all scientists. And you know why that's true? According to science, because only a few scientists possess creativity. Now that's, Moliere's audiences laughed, but no one laughs at science. You know. Now, there are very good ways in which a behavioristic account can deal with creativity, but it again must turn to conditions. The stimulus response formula is not adequate because behavior is not due so much to prior events as to events which follow. Our behavior is selective. It is shaped by what happens when we behave in given ways. And that selection is very much like natural selection in biology. Just as 10 million species have resulted from random variations selected by contributions to survival of individuals and species, so personal repertoires are selected when chance responses this way or that pay off and then become part of a person's repertoire. And just as natural selection is still having trouble making its case, this current interest in creationism in our schools, for example, so the behavioristic argument is having trouble too, primarily because it leaves no room for the creator. Now, that the creator in natural selection is defended very effectively. The creator in cognitive science is equally staunchly defended. To argue that one creates by selecting rather than by initiating does seem to damage the credit due the individual. I once gave a lecture on having a poem, where having is comparable to having a baby. And I pointed out that although a mother has a baby, and it's her baby, she doesn't contribute any of its features. She gave it half her genes, and the other half she got from her husband. So that nothing about the child is due to anything the mother did. She nourishes it, protects it while it's going on, while this process is going on, but has not created anything. There's nothing actually new. And I used the famous quotation from Samuel Butler that a hen is simply an egg's way of making another egg. And this is true of the human case as well. You pass on all of the essential properties, but you don't contribute to them. And I argue that a poet is simply a way in which a literary tradition makes more of a literary tradition. There is no creative inner force. The selection by consequences takes over the role of a supposed prior creator and will handle the whole question of creativity much more effectively than a cognitive analysis. The behavioral account of teaching and learning is, I think, fairly simple. It's not oversimplified. It just recognizes the essentials and gets rid of a lot of things which are not essential. It gets rid of the notion that when you learn something, you store something in your mind. The computer is entirely misleading here. The computer does store and retrieve, but it is much too close to a stimulus-response formulation, input and output. Computers could be made to learn from experience, as I've said, but they ordinarily don't. And education has, for millennia, assumed somehow or other that you are putting into the students something which is outside. Early education, until fairly recently, was almost entirely memorizing classics, religious books, great works of literature, that kind of thing, formularies. The poor students simply had to memorize, and they memorized under punitive conditions. After they had memorized, they could speak, and what they said was what you would say if you read the script or the scroll or the tablet or whatever the material was printed on. And that is still part of what we regard teaching as being. We're filling the student up with something which can then come forth and be accepted as a contribution. But there is a great deal wrong with storage. What is stored, of course, is behavior in the sense that we all have enormous amounts of behavior stored in us. Where in you right now is the behavior with which you'll get your supper tonight? Well, it isn't there in some mind stuff. It is simply part of what you as organisms will do at the right place at the right time because of what has happened to you in the past. In that sense, there is storage, but that is very different from storing ideas and the content of literary works. I don't know what those boys, and they were all boys in those days, got out of memorizing the classics. Certainly it wasn't merely a matter of being able to spout them afterward. They must have got some effects on their own verbal behavior. They must have learned a great deal simply from the mere torture of having to memorize these things. This may very well have helped, but it certainly was not any kind of great contribution. If you want to produce behavior, not stored in that sense, but simply behavior that will be appropriate to a situation, then you arrange contingencies under which that happens. And this can be the behavior of classroom management or the behavior of memorizing, of responding, learning what is in a text, and so on. The trouble with the concept of knowledge, of knowing, is that it takes away the probability of action. When you say that the rat now knows that pressing the lever will produce food, you have to ask, well, why will he press? Oh, well, because he's hungry, he wants food. But once you've taken the knowledge of the fact out of the tendency to respond, you have to put some tendency back in again. And that is one of the main problems. Having separated knowing in some passive sense from action, we then have no way of predicting whether anyone will make use of knowledge and do anything about it. Obviously, behavior modification is relevant here. It is a question of supplying additional reasons for action. If you want to get a class to behave well, you can arrange rather arbitrary, artificial contingencies of reinforcement, as in a token economy, or in a lottery, or in contract, in a contract analysis. There was a student who came to see me many years ago from, I think she was from Kentucky. Yes, I'm sure she was, because she had me appointed a colonel in Kentucky. But she had a sixth grade class, and they were just causing trouble. They wouldn't do their homework. They wouldn't do their assignments in class. She was desperate. And so she decided, although she was skeptical, to try some reinforcement. One day she brought in a cheap small radio, battery-operated radio. And she said, now, at the end of the week, we're going to have a lottery, and one of you is going to win this. Well, how are we going to get tickets? Well, every time you bring in your homework, you write your name on every slip, put it in that jar. Every time you finish an assignment in class, write your name on that slip, put it in the jar. And at the end of the week, we'll shake this all up, and we will draw one out, and that person will get the radio. Because it's amazing that they all began to do their homework, they all did their work in class. That it will cost $8 or $10 a week to come in with some new thing every week, but it was worth it. So see, it wasn't going to be burned out on this kind of thing. Well, that seems rather artificial. I can see why it would be attacked. You ought to have people learn because of a natural curiosity and so on. That's more of just putting something inside. I don't see any reason why students shouldn't be paid for learning. If you have the contingency set right. We complain about welfare. We feel there should be jobs in place of welfare, but there aren't any jobs. And you say, well, let's organize factories so that people who are now getting welfare will go to work and produce some of the goods they consume and pay for with their money from welfare. But that's creeping socialism, so that can't be done. However, it seems to me that, suppose, for example, and this would be particularly true where there's lack of motivation in education, suppose you actually paid students for learning, either working their way through programs or passing tests at a good level. And suppose that pay went, let's say, 25% to the student and 75% to the family. These are people on welfare. And here is a way in which you can create work which is not going to take work away from any existing industry. And I suspect that in that case, parents will begin to take an interest in how well their students did in school, and the students will begin to take an interest in what they did. There are, however, much more intimate consequences of learning which can be used. It just happens to be characteristic of the human species that success is reinforcing. If you push something that doesn't move, that's not good, but if it moves, you've been successful. And progress is getting on, doing things now you couldn't do earlier. That's very, very reinforcing. All you have to do is arrange matters so that there are lots of successes and lots of progress. And that is precisely what was done in programmed instruction. You break a subject up into very small steps, each of which can easily be taken, especially if well written, so that 75% of the time the student is right. And you have no idea how it is. If you ever go out, have you ever gone out in the car and for half an hour all the lights are green when you got to them? A marvelous feeling that you have at that point. Well, that's the feeling you have when you work through a program and you're always right. And moreover, the progress that you can make, seeing what you can do this week you couldn't do last week, it's a fantastic effect. And I can give you an example of that. There are some learning centers, so-called, in America, 400 or 500 of them. I had something to do with designing them originally many years ago. And they teach students how to read. Now, they teach them how to read. They teach all students how to read. Up above a certain cutoff point, certainly. I was in one of the centers in California a year or two ago. It just happened that the student population in the school was equally divided in four parts. Chicano, Asiatic, white American, black American, and they were all learning to read at the same speed. Now, these centers have little carols and a little tape recorder with a cassette and worksheets which have a magic ink feedback. And the student comes in, takes up where he left off, and no breaks, no gaps. The person who doesn't have a mathematical mind is the person who had the measles when they first took up fractions. That's about the way things are. And in this case, you never miss anything, but when you come back, you pick up where you were before. You put the cassette in, and you start work. The cassette, but to begin with, the cassette might say, draw a line from the word cat to a cat. Well, you have to know what the word cat means, and you draw the line. And if you're right, the line has a little tiger tail character to it, which becomes very reinforcing. And these programs go from primary grades right through junior high, and at the end, the student is reading substantial passages, responding to questions on the tape recorder by choosing replies and so on. And it is a way of teaching reading. Now, there are no reinforcers except those of progress and success. Although, actually, when a student reaches a certain point, he or she gets a picture taken, a Polaroid picture, with a thermometer, which, you know, that United Fund thermometer shows you how far along in the course the student is. Those pictures are highly reinforcing. Many of these kids have never had pictures taken before, for example. And that is a little extra, a little contrived fillip added to the thing. But students work at these things with an intensity which is remarkable. The programming takes control of the student. It supplies, it brings about not knowledge, but action, an absorption, continuation to work in a given way. There's no question, I think, in the long run, that Presley's Industrial Revolution is coming. The materially, machines available when I was working in this field 20, 25 years ago were very crude. But now, as you know, there's been enormous progress in the electronics industry, the chip, the techniques, and so on, the kinds of games that you buy at Christmas time and so on, which talk and reply and evaluate. There's no reason why very effective devices could not be built, which would have an extraordinary effect in education. What is going on now is not the right use of those devices. However, the educational uses which are being proposed consist of using computers to simulate physical processes, to do various things which are all very useful and will perhaps hold the interests of students, but they do not face up to the fact that what is needed most is an analysis of the learning process and the design of contingencies under which people really effectively learn. Now, the real question which confronts us is why these things are not more rapidly accepted and put into effect. The children of a nation are its most valuable natural resource, far more important than oil, gas, coal, steel, anything of that sort. And yet, although vast sums of money are paid, we are not really developing, making the best use of these resources. The tragedy of the lag between what we know can be done and what is done is not only greater here, but I think clearer. And I think the trouble is that progress in education is disruptive. Imagine that you can teach what is now taught in half the time with half the effort. I said that many years ago, and I still believe it is possible. Well, what happens in a school? If you teach, in the first grade, you teach all that was taught in the first and second grades. What do you teach in the second grade? Well, you can teach what was taught in the third and fourth, but you get way ahead of yourself here. And you turn students out, and they join the job force at the tender age of 10 or 11, and you are in real trouble. Well, the answer to that, I think, is that you should teach more. Teach what is taught in first grade in half the time, and give the teacher a chance to be a human being and talk to students, argue with students, get them interested in art, music, and so on. We do very little, really, in preparing Americans to enjoy leisure. We're very proud of the fact that we have a 40-hour week, but the real question is what happens to the other hours? And if it isn't a question of staring at the tube, what do you do? It's a wonderful opportunity to develop yourself, to do the kinds of things, music, science, art, literature, which make you a much more complete person tend to be sacrificed, and you get instead people who turn to, as leisure classes always have, to drugs, alcohol, drugs, gambling, violent sports, and so on. And that is largely the fault of education, which does not prepare students so that they know how wonderful it is, let's say, to play in a string quartet, or how wonderful it is to read good literature rather than cheap literature, or how wonderful it is to really appreciate fine painting rather than poster art and that kind of thing. I think if you could teach what you now teach in half the time, there should be no embarrassment, and the way should be open for making the teacher a human being, because anything that can be done by a machine should not be done by a teacher. It's dehumanizing. However, I think the ultimate answer to getting the establishment to change is to insist upon accountability. I know people don't like that. They don't like to be asked to demonstrate that they really have done something, but it is really wonderful to know you have done something. That is the very heart of reinforcement. Students it ought to be very clear to a student at the end of a day in college or in high school that he or she has learned something. It ought to be very clear to a teacher at the end of a day that he or she has taught something. There ought to be visible evidence that changes have taken place and that they've been important changes. And it ought to be clear to the public that supports education that it has got its money's worth, that people have taught well and students have learned well. At the present time, good teaching techniques are to be found primarily in business, because in business, someone looks at whether you're doing your job, and if you aren't doing it, you're fired. I don't mean to be ruthless about the educational establishment, but until there is some question raised about how effective techniques are, whether we should accept them as traditional or ask what they do, I see no hope for improvement. The main gain, however, is not that this will lead to some kind of regimentation in education, but that students, teacher, and the supporting public will all enjoy the natural reinforcing consequences of an effective technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Skinner, for a very provocative, very insightful presentation. You certainly admonish us to refocus our attention on the learner in a very profound way. I guess given the congestion in the audience, that I believe those microphones are live, rather than have the ushers try to move through the crowd, could we simply have people identify themselves who want to ask a question? I'll try to recognize a questioner, and I'll try to repeat the question from up here. Is that agreeable? Is there a question up here? Question over here. Would you identify yourself and state the question?
My name is Paul Tucker. I'm a grad student in psychology. Now, giving the learner essentially the responsibility for learning and saying it's his duty and his concern is essentially a free will attitude, a free willist attitude. That is, the teacher's manipulation of the environment is not affecting the student's behavior. Now, why would psychologists and even educators who ought to know better take that free willist attitude toward the actions of their students?
So you want to paraphrase the question?
Well, I'm saying that psychologists and educators are taking a free willist attitude toward their students in terms of giving them the responsibility for learning. Now, in psychology and also in education, we usually assume determinism, not free will. And so therefore, why are educators and psychologists taking a free willist attitude when their whole fields are more or less based upon the assumption of determinism?
Yes, well, I am, of course, pleading for a recognition of the essentially determined nature of behavior. And I think that the answer I would give to you is the answer I've given as to why we are not improving education. We are afraid of accepting the deterministic nature of behavior. We want to save something to be determined by the inner man or the inner woman. And it's true of psychologists, I think, who refuse to accept a thoroughgoing science of behavior, as it is of educators who refuse to accept the role which really falls to them of teaching so well that students learn whether or not they themselves make any contribution to it or not.
Are there other questions?
I thought everything was very clear.
My name's Michael Henson, and I was wondering what are some of the psychological after effects of discontinuing token rewards, like Columbus school systems are using it for attendance and stuff. Are they that great, or?
I'm not getting it.
The question is, what are the after effects of employing a token reward system after the token portion is withdrawn?
Oh yeah, well, that's very easily handled. Obviously, if you use a token system to achieve very specific goals in a very specific situation, you aren't, when you get a class to do its homework and to do its daily assignments this way, you have not prepared such a person to do any work outside the school where there's no token or lottery involved. However, presumably something has been learned as a result of the homework and as a result of the assignment. If that's not the case, then the whole educational system fails. You simply use the token to solve some of the overall problems of getting an application to a bit of studying and so on. You're not at the moment concerned with building people who will work hard in general. You want them to work hard at one task, and presumably it's the task that brings about the changes. So that you shouldn't worry about whether there will be no one in the world at large passing out tokens.
Down in front here. Can you teach creativity, or is that something that is
Yes. Well, you can teach people to be creative. You obviously, what you've taught someone to do is not creative. Obviously, you know why it has come about. But the creative artists, so I gave a talk on this at the Guggenheim Museum years ago called Creating the Creative Artist. And if you stop believing that somehow or other some great creative force inside produces the work of art, and instead look at what artists really do, you're on the road. The artist, for miscellaneous reasons, puts, let's say, I'm talking about painting, puts paint on a canvas. Now, some of those things are beautiful in the sense of reinforcing. I define reinforcing, that's all beautiful means. You buy beautiful things because looking at them is reinforced. And so the artist puts something on a canvas. If it looks good, if it's reinforcing to him, he leaves it on, otherwise he takes it off. Now, if he has universality, it will be reinforcing to others, and he's lucky. If he's a Van Gogh, he doesn't sell a single painting, and that's just too bad. But nevertheless, it was reinforcing to him, so he left it on. If it wasn't, he scrapes it off. And you learn how to produce variations. If you're painting too tightly, you just add an extra length to your brush, and you stand back and paint like this, and you will have a new character, and oh, that's great. So you leave it there. Or it's no good at all, and you take the thing apart again. These are the things that creative people do. You see mathematicians working this way. You take one of Euclid's axioms and take it over, turn it upside down or something. Composers do this. They take a theme and play it backward or upside down. And the creative person is a person who allows an enormous amount of change and variation and then selects those things which are effective, either in science or in art or in composition or anything of that sort. You can teach people to do that. And there are techniques of teaching creative thinking that work on this principle. Just get someone to take some ordinary, like a pencil. What can you do with a pencil? And then how many different kinds of things? You prop the window open and so on and so on and so on. So until you've broken down what a pencil is for writing, until it's something which is useful in 100 different contexts. And that kind of thing can free you pretty much from being too tightly controlled by a particular stimulus. And thereupon you are more likely to produce some novel effect which will, and it is novel because it just happened to occur, but you will then select as creative, as original. It's just as original as the species which come about from completely random variations selected by success in survival. Somebody else?
Yes, sir. I would like to know, how do you teach people that may have no desire to learn or may be under the influence of drugs or other social factors?
Yes, how do you teach people who have no desire to learn? Well, that is precisely what I have been, I think, talking about, because desire to learn is one of those things you put inside the student, and you say, this student does very well because he has a desire to learn. This student doesn't do well because he doesn't have a desire to learn. When you talk like that, you're in trouble, because that isn't the case. I can take a pigeon and get it to peck a disc 10,000 times in order to have access for 3 seconds to a dish of grain. It would go right back and peck 10,000 times again. Now you say, well, that pigeon certainly has a desire for food. Well, but it is, to get that, you have to have a long sequence. You start off, every peck pays off, and then every 5, and every 10, and every 50, and then every 100, and every 300, and it goes on up. Finally, it's every 10,000. You have built, in your terms, a desire to get food. All you really have done is to schedule a particular kind of scheduled performance, and you have what looks like a highly motivated pigeon. The child who has what you call no desire to learn is obviously not being affected by the results of studying. And that may be, well, that may happen for many reasons. I would say that first of all, start off with the token economy. In that case, find something that's reinforcing. Now, if there's nothing reinforcing to the child, then you're lost, because that's your only weapon, is to arrange a reinforcer. Whether you can starve him down a bit and use food, society might object to that, but it has been done successfully with psychotic people who are relatively out of touch with the world and nothing means much to them. But if you can put them on a point system where they have to buy their own meals and so on, they will begin to work and to produce the points, and they're much better off. It looks a little rough when you didn't give them any breakfast because they were short of points, but the main thing isn't the right to a breakfast that should be taken into account. It's the right to be excited and have something to do in the world, and you have to make things contingent to get that effect.
Question?
My name is Debbie Weber, and I'm an undergrad in the College of Education. And you mentioned the addition of music, art, literature, and science to education, possibly replacing drugs, violence, and sport. What is your opinion of sport in a child's life?
Would you summarize that? I'm getting an echo here or something.
What is your concern for or response to the role of sports in a child's life?
I don't particularly like highly competitive sports because they tend to prepare a person for a highly competitive existence, and I like to get my reinforcers from things themselves rather than by taking things away from other people. I think sports which develop physique, skills, talents, and so on are highly desirable. I would rank them along with science, art, music, literature as the things that are appropriate to culture in developing the individual, as distinct from drugs, gambling, violence, and so on, to which so many people turn. So I think that I myself have been very much interested in teaching artistic activities to my children. I never bothered to teach them sports because I'm no good at sports. I wouldn't make a very good teacher. But, no, I think participant sport is a very important thing. I have my doubts about watching other people behave. If it is simply a matter of skills, that's fine. But when it gets to the point where, I remember once a broadcasting company broadcasting a football game had a special microphone that would reveal the thud of body against body. And that gets a little brutal, I think.